I still remember how ordinary that evening felt, the kind that slips by unnoticed until it splits your life in two. I was folding laundry on the couch, half watching the news, half thinking about dinner, when his phone buzzed on the coffee table. I wasn't snooping, not really. The screen just lit up, bold and unapologetic, like it wanted to be seen. My name wasn't on that message. Another woman's was. And not just any woman. Her. At first, my brain tried to be kind to me. I told myself it was probably harmless, probably old business, probably nothing worth spiraling over. But then I read the words again, slower this time, and my chest tightened. He had agreed to meet her. He had written that it would be nice to catch up, that he was curious how she was doing. He said it was just a drink. Just a drink, as if history ever fits neatly into a glass. I sat there longer than I want to admit, the laundry forgotten, the room oddly quiet. My hands felt cold, like all the blood had drained out of them. Memories I didn't invite started knocking. How her name used to come up in arguments. How he once swore she was part of a closed chapter. Back then, he had said I was overthinking, that I should trust him. Sitting there, staring at that glowing screen, I realized trust doesn't shatter loudly. It cracks in silence, right when you're least prepared to hear it. What hurt wasn't just that he said yes to seeing her. It was how easily he did it, how casual the words felt, like he was choosing a different brand of milk instead of reopening a door that had almost wrecked us once. I could already hear his voice in my head, calm and reasonable, explaining that I was making a big deal out of nothing. He would say it was innocent. He would say he didn't want to be rude. He would say I should trust him. I didn't cry right away. That came later. First, there was this heavy stillness, like my body had decided to shut down to protect me. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water I didn't drink. I stared at the sink, noticing a tiny crack in the ceramic I'd never paid attention to before. Funny how betrayal sharpens your vision. Suddenly, every flaw stands out, every little imperfection you've been ignoring for years. When he came home later that night, I acted normal. That was the strangest part. I smiled, nodded, asked how his day was. He talked about work, about traffic, about nothing at all, and I watched him like he was a stranger renting space in my house. At one point, he mentioned her name casually, saying she had reached out and wanted to talk. He said it was no big deal and that I shouldn't worry. I remember thinking how odd it was that he sounded so confident, so sure I'd stay exactly where I was. That night, after he fell asleep, I stayed awake listening to the familiar sounds of our house, each one suddenly chudged, like they belonged to another life. His breathing was steady, almost peaceful, and I wondered how someone could rest so easily while quietly dismantling what we'd built. I stared at the ceiling and felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but resolve. The kind that settles deep and doesn't ask for permission. I knew then that confronting him right away would only give him the control he expected. The next morning, I moved through my routine on autopilot. I made coffee, fed the cat, answered emails, all while my mind replayed that message like a song I couldn't turn off. When he kissed my cheek goodbye, I noticed how practiced it felt, how his hand lingered just long enough to look sincere. He said he'd be out with a friend later that week, his tone light, almost cheerful. I nodded, forcing a smile, realizing he had already written the script where I stayed clueless and forgiving. As soon as the door closed behind him, I sat down and opened my phone. My heart was pounding now, loud enough that I could hear it in my ears. I scrolled past names I hadn't touched in years, past memories I'd packed away neatly, until I found one I never fully erased. Seeing my ex's name felt dangerous and oddly comforting at the same time. I hesitated for a second, then typed the first message, knowing that whatever came next would change the direction of everything. Seeing his name on my screen felt like opening a drawer I'd sworn I'd never touch again. My ex belonged to a version of me that was louder, messier, and a lot less careful with her heart. Back then, I had loved him with my whole chest, the kind of love that doesn't negotiate or play it safe. We didn't end because we stopped feeling things. We ended because timing can be cruel, and pride can be louder than love. I stared at the blinking cursor longer than I should have. Part of me whispered that this was a bad idea, that I was poking a sleeping animal I'd worked hard to forget. Another part of me, the one that had been quietly shrinking inside my marriage, felt a spark of something almost like relief. I didn't write a long explanation. I kept it simple, casual, like I hadn't rehearsed it in my head a dozen times. I asked how he was doing. I said I was in town. I suggested a drink. His reply came faster than I expected. Too fast for comfort, too fast to pretend this was meaningless. He said it had been a long time. He said he'd wondered about me. He said he was free that same night. Reading his words, I felt a mix of nostalgia and fear twist together inside me. I wasn't chasing him. I kept telling myself that. I was just stepping into a moment my husband had already opened the door to. Once it was set, I couldn't undo it, even if I wanted to. The date, the time, the place, it all lined up too perfectly, like some cruel joke the universe was in on. The same night my husband would be sitting across from his past, smiling like nothing was wrong, I'd be doing the exact same thing. The thought made my stomach flip, not with excitement, but with a sharp, nervous energy that kept me moving. I told myself this wasn't about romance. It was about balance. About not being the only one left in the dark. All day, my mind drifted in and out of old memories. I remembered how my ex used to look at me like I was the only person in the room, how conversations with him felt easy, unfiltered. Then I'd snap back to the present and feel the weight of my wedding ring, cool and familiar against my skin. I caught myself twisting it around my finger, over and over, like it might suddenly tell me what the right choice was. It didn't. It just sat there, silent and heavy. When my husband mentioned his plans again that evening, he did it with a careless confidence that made my jaw tighten. He said he'd be late and asked me not to wait up. He said it like it was a favor to me. I nodded, kept my voice steady, and told him I had plans too. The look on his face flickered for just a second. Surprise, maybe curiosity. But he didn't ask with whom. That was the moment I realized how little he actually wanted to know. Getting ready that night felt strangely ceremonial, like I was stepping into a role I hadn't auditioned for, but somehow knew by heart. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, noticing the fine lines around my eyes, the quiet strength in my posture that hadn't always been there. I didn't dress to impress. I dressed to recognize myself. Something simple, something honest, something that didn't ask for approval. As I fastened my necklace, my hands trembled just enough to remind me this wasn't pretend. Before leaving, I paused in the hallway and listened to the house breathe. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, the familiar stillness that once meant safety. I wondered if he felt even a fraction of this weight as he walked out the door earlier, or if his excitement drowned it out completely. For a fleeting second, I imagined staying home, confronting him, demanding answers. But that version of the night felt small, predictable. I wanted something else now, something that belonged to me. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt cooler than I expected, sharp against my skin. I locked the door and stood there for a moment, keys clenched in my hand, heart racing. Somewhere across the city, my husband was already seated, revisiting a past he claimed didn't matter. And somewhere not far from there, my own past was waiting for me too. I took a deep breath, got into my car, and drove toward a night that promised nothing except change. The restaurant was dimly lit, the kind of place that makes everyone look a little softer than they really are. When I saw him standing near the entrance, my chest tightened in a way I hadn't expected. Time had changed him, but not completely. His hair was a little darker at the temples, his smile a little more cautious. Yet when our eyes met, something familiar stirred, like a song I still knew the words to. He hugged me, briefly, politely, but I felt the echo of what used to be there. We sat across from each other, menus forgotten, talking about safe things at first. Work, mutual acquaintances, the city. His voice was calm, steady, and I noticed how carefully he watched me, like he was trying to read between my words. At one point, he said it was good to see me again, that he hadn't realized how much he'd missed our conversations. He said it without pressure, without expectation, and that honesty caught me off guard more than any flirtation would have. As he spoke, my mind kept drifting elsewhere. I pictured my husband leaning forward in his chair, laughing too easily, telling stories I'd already heard 100 times. I imagined him minimizing our marriage with every shared memory he revisited with her. Sitting there, listening to my ex, I realized how different this felt. No secrecy, no rewriting of truth. Just two people acknowledging what had been and what was no longer possible. And yet, the night was only beginning, and I could feel the tension building, quiet and insistent, like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. As the wine glasses slowly emptied, the conversation deepened, drifting away from polite updates and into things we'd never quite finished saying. He talked about mistakes he'd made after we broke up, about choices that looked right at the time and hollow in hindsight. I listened closely, surprised by how much of myself I recognized in his words. There was no blame in his tone, no attempt to rewrite our ending into something prettier. He simply acknowledged it, and that quiet accountability settled between us like a rare kind of peace. At one point, he asked if I was happy, not casually, not as small talk. He leaned back in his chair and waited, really waited, like he was ready for an honest answer. For a second, I considered lying. I could have said I was fine, that life had turned out the way it was supposed to. Instead, I paused, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass, and said that happiness was more complicated than it used to be. He nodded, as if he understood exactly what I meant without needing more details. Across the table, I caught my reflection in the dark window behind him. I looked composed, even confident, but I could see the woman underneath, balancing on the edge of a truth she hadn't fully faced yet. Somewhere nearby, my husband was probably telling his ex that nothing had changed between them, or maybe that everything had. The thought no longer sent a jolt of panic through me. Instead, it brought a strange calm. For the first time that night, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. When the check arrived, neither of us reached for it right away. We just sat there, the moment stretching, heavy with things unsaid. He finally broke the silence, saying he was glad I'd called him, that the timing felt strange but meaningful. He said it carefully, like he didn't want to scare me off or step over a line. I appreciated that more than I expected. There was respect there, something I realized I'd been missing for a long time without naming it. As we stood to leave, our hands brushed, accidental but charged. It wasn't electric like it used to be. It was quieter, steadier, like recognition instead of hunger. Outside, the night air wrapped around us, cool and grounding. He asked if I was okay getting home, if I needed anything. I shook my head, smiled, and told him I was fine, and I meant it. For the first time in days, I truly felt steady on my feet. Driving home, the city lights blurred past me, and my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I didn't look at it right away. I already knew who it was from. Somewhere across town, my husband was finishing his own night, probably rehearsing explanations I hadn't asked for yet. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, aware that the next conversation would change everything. Tonight hadn't been about replacing him. It had been about remembering myself. And now that I had, there was no going back. The next morning felt deceptively normal, which somehow made everything heavier. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, landing on the same counter where we'd shared countless quiet breakfasts. I poured coffee and listened to the familiar drip, 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 thinking how strange it was that the world didn't pause for betrayal. My husband walked in like nothing had shifted, loosening his tie, yawning, asking if there was any coffee left. He didn't look guilty. He looked comfortable. He talked first, of course. He said he'd had a long night. He said he was tired. Then, almost casually, he mentioned meeting his ex, explaining it away before I'd even asked. He said it was just closure, that she needed to talk, that he didn't want to be rude. He said it was harmless, almost noble, like he'd done everyone a favor. I watched his mouth move, noting how easily the words came to him, how practiced his tone was. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. I just sipped my coffee and let him keep going, because sometimes the truth shows itself best when you give it room to breathe. He mistook my silence for agreement, maybe even relief. He reached for my hand and said he hoped I wasn't upset. In that moment, I realized he wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of being inconvenienced. And that quiet realization settled inside me, sharp and permanent, changing the way I looked at the man sitting across from me. He kept talking, filling the space with explanations I hadn't asked for, as if the sheer volume of his words could smooth over what he'd done. He said he chose me every day. He said I was overthinking it. He even said he didn't tell me right away because he knew I'd react emotionally. That one almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I felt something close off inside me, like a door quietly locking itself for good. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me. It was calm, measured, almost gentle. I said I understood why he wanted to see her. I said I knew what it felt like to revisit the past, to wonder about unfinished chapters. He blinked at that, clearly not expecting empathy. For a brief second, confusion flickered across his face, and I could tell he was recalculating, trying to figure out which version of me he was dealing with now. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't mention the dinner, the wine, the way my ex had listened without defensiveness. I simply said that trust isn't something you test for curiosity's sake. I said that once it cracks, it never sounds the same again. He frowned, defensive again, and said I was making it dramatic. That was when I realized he still thought this conversation would end on his terms. He had no idea I'd already stepped out of the role he'd assigned me. Later that evening, he tried a different approach. He cooked dinner, poured wine, even put on music he knew I used to love. It felt like a performance, one he'd rehearsed in previous arguments, when gestures were supposed to replace accountability. I watched him move around the kitchen, confident again, as if effort alone could rewind time. He said he hated tension between us. He said he wanted things to go back to normal. I realized then how deeply he misunderstood what normal meant to me now. I told him I needed space, not in the dramatic way he expected, but plainly, firmly. I said I needed time to think. He frowned, clearly irritated, and said space only made things worse. He said couples worked through issues together. He said I shouldn't shut him out over something so small. That word, small, hung in the air between us, heavy and offensive. It told me everything I needed to know about how he ranked my feelings. That night, lying beside him, I felt miles away. I stared into the dark, replaying his words, my own restraint, the way power had quietly shifted without him noticing. He thought this was a rough patch. I knew it was a turning point. Somewhere deep inside, a decision was forming, not fueled by rage, but by clarity. And clarity, I was learning, was far more dangerous than anger. By the time morning came, my mind felt strangely quiet, like the storm had already passed and left something cleaner behind. I went through my routine slowly, deliberately, noticing how steady my hands were now. No shaking, no racing thoughts. Just this calm certainty that I couldn't unknow what I knew. I made breakfast for myself only, sat at the table alone, and realized how rare it had become for me to actually listen to my own thoughts without interruption. My husband tried to act normal again, humming softly as he got dressed, asking if I had any plans for the day. I answered politely, vaguely, the way you do when you're already halfway gone. Inside, I was replaying the last few days like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place. His casual lies, his confidence that I'd stay, the way he treated my hurt like an inconvenience. None of it felt shocking anymore. It felt obvious, like a truth that had been waiting for me to stop making excuses. Later, alone in the house, I sat on the edge of the bed and held my phone, scrolling through old photos, old messages, old versions of myself. I wasn't angry at the woman I used to be. I felt tenderness for her. She had loved deeply and trusted fully, and that mattered. But she was done carrying the weight of someone else's selfish choices. As I stood up, a decision settled fully into my chest. Whatever happened next wouldn't be impulsive. It would be intentional. And that, I knew, was where the real consequences would begin. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't dramatize it or wrap it in tears. Instead, I started doing small, practical things that looked harmless on the surface. I gathered documents I'd ignored for years, skimmed through bank statements, reread agreements we'd signed without much thought back then. Funny how trust makes you careless. Funny how clarity makes you meticulous. With every page, I felt more grounded, more in control of a story I'd let him narrate for too long. When he called me from work, his tone was lighter than it deserved to be. He asked if I'd calmed down, if things were better. I told him I'd been thinking a lot. I said I understood now why he felt entitled to revisit his past. I said I didn't want to stand in the way of that curiosity. There was a pause on the line, the kind that betrays sudden unease. He asked what I meant, and I replied that choices always come with consequences, even the quiet ones. I could almost hear him straightening in his chair. That evening, when he came home, he sensed it immediately. The house felt different, stripped of tension, but also stripped of warmth. I didn't ask where he'd been. I didn't ask how his day went. I simply told him we needed to talk soon, not tonight, but soon. I said it calmly, without accusation. That was when I saw it, real fear, flickering across his face for the first time. Not fear of losing love, but fear of losing control. And that told me my timing was perfect. We talked 2 days later, not in the heat of an argument, but in the cold clarity of daylight. I chose the living room, sat across from him, and waited until he finished whatever speech he'd rehearsed on the drive home. He said he was sorry if I'd been hurt. He said nothing really happened. He said he never meant to jeopardize our marriage. I let him finish, then told him this wasn't a trial and I wasn't asking for a confession. I said I'd already made my decision. I explained calmly that while he was revisiting his past, I had taken a closer look at our present. I told him I wouldn't compete with ghosts or accept a love that needed constant reassurance to stay loyal. I said I'd contacted a lawyer, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. He stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman speaking, like I'd suddenly switched languages without warning. He asked if this was revenge. I told him revenge is loud. This was closure. That night, after he packed a bag and left, the house felt impossibly quiet. But it wasn't the hollow kind of silence I'd feared. It felt earned. I opened a window, let the cool air wash through the room, and sat on the floor, breathing deeply. Somewhere behind me, a door had closed. Somewhere ahead, something lighter was waiting. I didn't know exactly what came next, but for the first time in a long while, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't walking toward it carrying his weight anymore. Time did what it always does when you finally stop fighting it. Days turned into weeks, and the sharp edges of everything slowly softened. I moved through my life differently now, more aware of my own space, my own rhythm. Mornings became quieter, not lonely, just intentional. I learned which silences fed me and which ones I no longer needed to tolerate. His absence stopped feeling like a loss and started feeling like room. People asked questions, of course. Some were subtle, some invasive, all of them curious. I didn't give explanations I didn't owe. I simply said things ended because they no longer fit. And that was true. What I didn't say was how much strength it took to choose myself after years of choosing us. How terrifying it was to realize that love without respect slowly teaches you to disappear. Sometimes, usually late at night, I thought about that dinner, about parallel tables and parallel choices. I understood then that my revenge was never about matching his betrayal. It was about refusing to stay in a story where I was always expected to forgive first and feel later. Walking away didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. I heard through mutual friends that he was confused, that he kept saying he never thought I'd actually leave. Apparently, he told people it all escalated too fast, that it was just a misunderstanding that got out of hand. I didn't correct the narrative. Let him believe whatever version helps him sleep. I wasn't interested in being understood by someone who never truly listened when it mattered. Some lessons don't land unless they sting. What surprised me most was how little I missed the version of him I'd invented in my head. The real man, the one who minimized, justified, and assumed my silence meant consent, felt distant now, almost abstract. In his place was a clearer memory of myself, the woman who noticed the cracks, who chose dignity over comfort, who didn't need fireworks to make a decision stick. That woman felt solid, familiar, like someone I'd been trying to get back to for years. On quiet afternoons, I'd make coffee and sit by the window, watching the light shift across the room. Small moments like that became my proof that I'd done the right thing. No audience, no applause, just peace settling in where anxiety used to live. I didn't win by hurting him. I won by no longer needing to.